This is Undead Citadel for the MetaQuest 2 and 3. This joins the ranks of games like Blade and Sorcery and Swordsman VR as another physics-based slasher on the Quest. Guys, I've killed hundreds of the undead in the name of research, so stick around and I'll let you know if this was worth the wait. Hey guys, it's Chris from the VR Grid and welcome to the channel. If you like this video, give it a like, and if you're interested in more VR content from us, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss new videos as they drop. And if you're looking to join our VR conversations, feel free to leave a comment, or even better, join us here on the YouTube each and every Thursday live at 6 p.m. Pacific for the Virtual Boys podcast. Undead Citadel wastes no time in getting players into the carnage, not even letting story get in its way. Essentially, you are a soldier hellbent on getting to the depths of a heavily fortified citadel to end the onslaught of the undead. And that's about all there is to it, and I'm absolutely fine with that, as I came for the combat, not the story. Looking first at the gameplay options awaiting players, we are greeted with the usual Horde mode, which offers up 3 wave-based arenas in which players can gear up with their favorite weapons from their selection of unlocked weapons in their armory. Additionally, if players simply want to try out their new weapons quickly without jumping into a full Horde mode, they can head right into the armory game option itself and spawn a few enemies to practice with. Again, the weapons on offer are pulled from your collection of unlocked weapons, and Undead Citadel offers up a pretty complete collection of medieval era weapons. In fact, there are 80 in total, and range from single and two-handed swords, blunt weapons, and battle axes, as well as a collection of bows for ranged attacks and firebombs that can be thrown. Additionally, players can arm themselves with an assortment of potions that when used can buff your character with abilities such as freeze attacks, heavy attacks, and the option to temporarily slow down incoming and outgoing attacks. However, all these fun little toys are locked at the outset of the game, which takes us to the primary game mode in Undead Citadel, the single player campaign. Now this is something I've wanted from games like Blade and Sorcery and Hellsplit Arena. For as fun as tearing apart enemies is, I personally found that I craved some sense of progression beyond beating waves of enemies, and I wanted a world to explore while I killed things. Undead Citadel offers players a fairly linear single player campaign that will take about 5 to 6 hours to progress through, and while it certainly isn't the deepest gameplay experience I've ever had, I found it a very welcome addition to this style of VR slasher. Taking place almost entirely inside the Citadel walls, the bulk of the campaign revolves around a collection of areas, each with a locked or blocked exit that requires players to find that exit key or a flame to burn away the rubble. Throughout these areas are buildings that can be and should be entered and explored. Areas often contain a lot of these buildings, with some having multiple entrances, and I'll admit that going through these can get a bit tiresome, but is saved somewhat by the excellent variety in their layouts and designs, making for little repetition of building interiors, and this really helped to keep things a bit fresh. Often, buildings contain nothing but food to heal yourself with, but exploring is key, as it may give you advantage points on enemies in the street, reveal hidden keys, and can be especially useful on the game's higher difficulty levels, as scrounging can reveal hidden consumables such as potions and firebombs, as well as hidden chests that can contain more consumables, in addition to rare and higher end weapons than the ones you might pull off dead enemies. As I previously mentioned, melee weapons range between blade and blunt, as well as single and two-handed weapons. Each found weapon is rated for both its damage and durability, with the latter changing as the weapon is used, allowing players to tell how much usage is left in the weapon. And if you're not understanding what I'm saying, yes, weapons break here. Found melee weapons, regardless of size, can be stored on either side of your waist, with potions being stored on the front of your belt. Additionally, there are a few different bows to be found in the world, and when acquired can be stored on your left shoulder, with a quiver of arrows stored on your right. And now that brings me to combat. As with a game like this, it's either going to live or die on whether that aspect of the game works. Undead Citadel's world and combat system both revolve around a real-world physics engine, and that is both the game's best attribute, but also where things start to come apart a bit. First, let's talk about the good. Coming in a variety of configurations and armaments, enemies can be quite lively and unpredictable, flowing into the streets from buildings, above walkways, or perched on ledges, bow in hands. I rarely felt like I was simply being attacked by simply another wave of enemies. Instead, the game attempts to make encounters feel more organic, often letting players stumble into a situation where they might aggro a single character crouched over on the street, and not really knowing whether they had just brought hell down upon themselves in the form of a gang of enemies. These aren't the smartest enemies I've ever fought, but they animate really well and fought dynamically enough that it makes combat feel like a real fight, rather than just swinging at polygons that would flail into a death animation, say like the recently released Everslot. Greatly lending to the dynamics of combat is the different enemies that you'll encounter. You won't find a lot of variety in the types of enemies found here, as they are mostly all ground-based soldiers, but enemies range in their size and attack styles, coming at you in various states of decay and armor, and this can drastically change up how you must deal with them. Whether armed with simply a wood shield or adorned head to toe in heavy armor, enemies' defenses are breakable, and as such, using the right weapon can make all the difference. Need to get to the brain bag of a minion wearing full headgear? Try a spiked mace to expose their head, then bash it to a pulp. Or swing a blade and lop the head straight off. Enemies may not be smart, but learning how to best deal with different variations of them, whether using a melee weapon or my trusty bow, was often quite challenging, and especially when they came at me in numbers. Honestly, combat could have been a bit more gruesome here for my taste, but yes, enemies can be beheaded, crushed, delimbed, and relieved of their lower torso. However, this is where the game's wonky physics start to take away from the fun. Weapons, well, not as weighty as something found in Blade and Sorcery or the Walking Dead games, do indeed have a bit of weight to them, with longer and heavier weapons requiring two hands to use them effectively. Unfortunately, enemies never felt like they themselves had much weight to them, and I found that my attacks would often grab them and fling them around like they were simply stuffed animals. This, when combined with weapons getting stuck inside enemies and some weird animations, and Undead Citadel's combat starts to lose some of its luster. Further to this, enemies never feel like they really have any substance to them. Admittedly, this isn't helped by the fact that I'm getting used to the heavier haptics of the PSVR 2 DualSense controllers, but when carving up or bashing enemies, it just never felt like I was hitting anything with any sense of impact, and enemies seem to often just carve up with little fanfare or gruesome fun. Now, don't get me wrong though, guys, I actually still had a good time here killing the undead, but I could never quite rid myself of the feeling that this game could have benefited from a bit more time dialing in fighting physics and how the enemies react to being hit. As such, I truly hope that the developers continue to patch the combat here, as games like Blade and Sorcery, Hellsplit Arena, and Swordsman VR all started out pretty rough in these same regards, and to various degrees of success have greatly improved from their initial launch. Outside of the combat though, Undead Citadel is still a physics-based VR game, and whether players are setting up candles in darkly lit buildings, throwing around pots, or pulling over heavy bookcases, those who like to experiment with VR physics will likely find a lot to love here, as the game is filled with fun things to fool around with. Now, when taken as a whole, Undead Citadel is actually a very simple game. There are no RPG elements or upgrade systems to speak of, and you'll find most of your time fending off similar enemies while searching abandoned buildings to find health, potions, and better weapons. Walking around a house draped in blinding darkness with only a candle in hand to light my way is easily one of my favorite VR moments in quite some time, as I creeped up the stairs to seek out what was upstairs, making those floorboards creak. And it is also here where the game's excellent sound design comes into play, as many a times I walked into a building seeking sustenance to heal from a previous fight, only to hear the grunts, growls, and creaking floorboards of enemies lying in wait. Okay, so let's talk about the elephant in the room, and that is the game's graphics. Undead Citadel has been out on PC for about a year now, and if you're familiar with that version of the game, then you know that it was visually a very beautiful game on PC, and it sported some truly impressive lighting and shadow effects. Now, while this may be the complete Undead Citadel experience gameplay-wise on the Quest, visually it does see quite the downgrade on the Quest. Now, yes, this is available for the Quest 2 and Quest 3, and I am playing this on the 3, but I don't think there are any enhancements as of yet, so this is the graphical experience across all Quest headsets at launch. And that experience, well, it's okay. Honestly, I'm kind of impressed in how much of the PC version's visual style developer Dark Curie has managed to retain here for the standalone hardware. It's not quite up there with the ports of, say, Hubris or the greatness of Red Matter 2, but it's a much better port than something like Wizard's Dark Times. The big thing here is that the game has managed to retain at least some semblance of its excellent dynamic lighting effects from the PC version. This made creeping around the game's city dwellings such a neat experience over on PC, and while it's obviously toned down and not as sophisticated for mobile chipsets, it is still here, and it makes walking around lighting up darkly lit areas in the game world still feel fun. Dynamic lighting is usually the first thing to go on Quest 2 titles, so I applaud the developers for keeping it somewhat here. The game's earlier stages see the game's locales draped in the darkness of night, and honestly, with its dynamic lighting at play, this is where Undead Citadel looks its best on the Quest, as it can hide some of its graphical shortcomings. Textures are pretty blurry, and the game uses a fairly aggressive foveated rendering technique for just about anything more than 20 feet ahead of you, aggressively dropping off detail beyond this. Additionally, even with these visual downgrades, the game still has pop-in issues, which of course is worse when out in the open streets, and this is at night. All these issues are simply harder to ignore during the day, and it makes it hard not to feel like you're playing a game that was previously designed to run on higher powered hardware and just throttled down to work here. That being said though, guys, I do have to say, this port never feels graphically sloppy, and it's obvious that a lot of time has gone into trying to make this run on the Quest ecosystem, and it plays well, running at a reasonably smooth frame rate and feeling comfortable even when in larger combat encounters. Speaking of combat situations, being a physics-based slasher, I am happy to report that most, if not all of the physics-based encounters, both in and out of combat, seem to have made the jump to mobile. Enemies may be missing a few animations here and there, maybe not moving quite as smooth, but the game's ragdoll physics, jank and all, remain, along with body dismemberment that, we all want in a game like this. And that brings me to my final thoughts and review score. Guys, I reviewed this a while back when it first dropped on PC, and in that review I said that the game had some jank and the combat lacked a sense of weight to it. I went on to say that the game seems to run out of ideas about halfway through its campaign runtime, making it feel like it was still in early access at times. Unfortunately, I still stand by all of this, and now on Quest the game simply doesn't have the visual finesse that it did on PC, which did help it overshadow some but not all of its issues. That being said, I still had fun with Undead Citadel here on Quest, and the game is less janky than when it launched on PC. I think as long as you know what you're getting going in here, and you don't mind the visual downgrade, there's still some good VR times to be had here. The VR Grid gives Undead Citadel on the Quest a 6.5 out of 10. Over on PC, Undead Citadel had its graphics to set it apart from some of its competition. Here on Quest, without that window dressing to shield it, the competition is real, coming from the likes of Blade and Sorcery, Battle Talent, and Dungeons of Eternity. If you pick this up, let me know in the comments how you think it holds up to those.